We have seen Solomon instruct his son on a few different topics leading up to today. We have seen him talk about the importance of keeping good company. Let me turn that mic on. Keeping good company, and the problems that are associated with running with the wrong crowd. And specifically, he begins to talk about those who plunder and try and gain money from unjust gain. And get in with a crowd that kind of begins to champion each other as they're accumulating wealth from wrong reasons. And certainly we have seen how that plays out in our world. We have seen Solomon talk about the importance of guarding your heart. Your heart is the wellspring of life. And, much of the decisions you make and the things that come out of your mouth ultimately come from the heart. Jesus will later say what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. We have heard him talk about just the importance of walking the good and right path, and there will be other temptations and lures that will come along to get you off that path of wisdom and to be steadfast in walking that path. And this morning we come as Solomon begins to teach his son about the topic of sexuality. And really from Proverbs 5 to 7, he deals with sexuality and its various forms, temptation, adultery. What we're going to look at this morning is specifically Proverbs 5 as he begins to talk about temptation and adultery. And, as we come to this particular passage, if I had to give it a rating, I would probably rate it M for mature. Much of what is said here, perhaps some of you have spent time in churches and you haven't heard maybe a lot of specific address about sexuality and God's design for it. A lot of people get a lot of their thoughts on sexuality and what all they think about it from the world, because the world is not ashamed of teaching and propagating certain things. But I think a lot of us, we come to passages like Proverbs 5 and we think, oh man, this is vivid. This is kind of candid and honest. And for some of us, we think it's a bit sensitive to address something like this from the pulpit, and a lot of churches through the ages have said, you know what, let's not give a lot of time, maybe very little or none at all, to speaking about sexuality from the pulpit because of the nature of it and the mixed company and that sort of thing. But at Exodus, we think, no, all of God's word is given for all the edification of all the saints, and we want to preach the whole counsel of God's word from the pulpit. And so it would be an odd thing to go to Proverbs 4 and then to skip over 5 through 7 and then go right into 8. We would think, what's going on in 5 through 7? And why are we holding back from that? So today we talk about sexuality. And, I recognize as we talk about this, we live in an overly sexualized culture. And it has been that way for a long time. It's in our faces. The world has no problem with talking about sexuality. And so Christians should have no problem about talking about it as well, because the world proposes sexuality that distorts God's good plan, and the world's sexuality leads to ruin. So what I want to do this morning is look here at Proverbs 5 as Solomon, the father, tells his boy, hey, come over here, son. Let me tell you about some things that are coming down the pike for you. You live in this world, you will be lured. There will be some level of affection that you will feel and some kind of a draw that you will have to sexual expression outside the marriage covenant. You're going to feel it. And there are going to be forbidden women, or the unchaste woman that comes out of Proverbs 5. They will manifest in your life and they will lure you. They will lure you into adultery, and I'm telling you, beware of it. And don't give in to it. When we come to Proverbs 5, we think, obviously, well, this is Solomon, a father to a young son. Of course, this is a message for young men. After all, young men are particularly vulnerable. Hormones are higher. Passions are a little bit higher. Usually men are more driven for a sexual appetite than women. Not always the case, but usually. And so, of course, we would expect a father to sit down his son and tell him these types of things. But what I want to challenge you with is this is not just a message for young men. And it's not just a message for young men who may be single or married. This is a message for young women, whether you're single or married. And this is a message that's very relevant for older men and women, whether you're single or married. There's much here that is stimulating enough for us to think about, regardless of who you are. Because the reality is, no matter who you are, no matter how much you live life long enough, you will experience sexual temptation. You will experience a lure. Perhaps you have experienced and have had some sexual encounters from the past that you're not very fond of. You wish to erase that memory. The reality is that living in a broken world, we're always going to feel some level of sexual temptation no matter who you are. And sexual sin can shipwreck your life. It can shipwreck the people that are around you. I'll just give an example. I mean, we think about the divorce rate now. And actually, as probably most of you know, the divorce rate has grown for quite a while, but it's actually kind of panned out. Conservative numbers say that about 42% of people are divorced or have been divorced. It's panned out now because, honestly, a lot of younger generations have seen the shipwreck and the marriage covenant coming undone with their parents and older generations, and honestly, a lot of them are just pushing off the institution of marriage. Why even get in this institution? I've seen all the shipwreck. And so younger generations look and they've seen, so they're just not getting married. This thing we call the institution of marriage, where the state blesses it, and if you were to ever break off later, it's going to come with repercussions. Usually for the male, he has to give away his money. So a lot of younger generations just say, why would I even engage in marriage? I can have all the benefits of marriage without that. I can have the cohabitation. I can have the sex. I can have the companionship. I can have whatever marriage is supposed to give people without that legal status. So actually, the divorce rate is staying the same. But the reason why I bring up the divorce rate is because the reality is you and I know what the number one thing that precipitates a divorce is lack of commitment. And usually, it's from adultery. That is the number, out of all the stats, you just go look it up, this is the number one precipitating thing for divorce. We all have had friends who have played out stories like that, and not just loved ones, friends that we know, that we've known for a long time, loved ones, family members, but respected leaders. I mean, how many pastors? You could probably think about a number of pastors that have had somewhat successful ministries who have gone down a wrong path and engaged in adultery and then lost it all. We've all been tempted. We've all been lured, and to pretend like that temptation is not a struggle for you or has never been is just silly. God is not deceived. So this is a message really for everyone. And what I want us to see this morning is what Solomon wants his son to see, not just the folly of adultery that is precipitated by temptation, but actually to contrast that with the beauty and the wisdom of sexuality within the marriage covenant. That's really where he goes. But he begins with an admonition and a warning. Look with me, verses 1-6. He says, Proverbs 5 here, "My son, be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end, she is bitter. Bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it." Few things being said here. First, just think about the urgency from this father. As he sits his son down, we don't know the age of his son. We don't know if he is married or on the cusp of being married. We do know from the ancient Near East culture that they would typically marry younger than us, right? In our culture, sometimes, Jehoiakim, we read, gets married at the age of 16. Some even as young as 14. We don't know if this son is married or not, but listen to the urgency of the father here. He's saying, incline your ear. Listen to this. And we've seen that in chapter 4. We've seen it in chapter 1. So many of the lectures from this father to the son is, son, you need to listen to this. Urgently. You need to listen. And it's not that the son just needs to listen so he knows what his father's message is. But actually what's enveloped here is that this son would actually begin, especially when the temptation is the hottest, to be able to speak that truth outwardly. Not just that he knows it, but he would speak it. You realize that in verse 2 there, where he talks about your lips may guard knowledge. The idea there is that in the heat of temptation, that you would be able to speak, rehearse God's words, rehearse this to yourself. One commentator said this is a bit like Joseph when he's in the palace, when Potiphar's wife comes to seduce him. And Joseph says, no, and he speaks the truth to himself and to her and evades that temptation. So that's the first thing. Notice the urgency here from this father to the son. But the second thing, notice the description of this forbidden woman or this unchaste woman. Her lips drip honey. This is like saying her lips, she is very attractive. She has a seductive charm about her. People can look and see there's an attraction here physically. But not just her physical attraction, what comes out of her mouth? Her speech is smoother than oil. This is like saying she knows how to speak. She's deceitfully flattering. The Hebrew seems to kind of connotate, it's really easy to be in her company. She speaks in such a way that it's enticing, it's entertaining, there's some kind of mystery to it, and it lures in. What the father says here is, look, she's going to look and she's going to sound very appealing. But the reality is, in the end, verse 4, she's going to be bitter. For the person who does go through that door, for the person who does come that way, they're going to recognize all that sweetness is actually bitter. The honey is sweet, but the bee stings. The pain she inflicts is like wormwood. This is an Old Testament way of saying she's poisonous. Wormwood, there were other plants that were poisonous that associated with wormwood, and he's saying, look, she looks great. It's going to be poison for you. So just think about all he's saying. She's attractive. Her physical appearance is attractive. Her speech is very seductive. Her feet, what's her feet doing? It's not moving forward in life. Her feet are going down. He says they're going down to Sheol. And she's seeking to grab other people and catch them and to drag them down with her. She is superficial. She's a wanderer. She is not someone who sits around pondering God's ways or pondering life, period. She's a wanderer and she doesn't even know it. Now, I got to be honest, when I read this description of the forbidden woman, honestly, I immediately started thinking about the pornography industry. I mean, how much of the language here really associates with the porn industry that has captured so many men, not just young, old, and not just men, but there's a growing stat saying that more and more women are engaged in pornography as well. It's not just a man sin. It's not just a thing that catches men, but certainly we have seen so many people get hooked into the pornography industry that do not want to be and spiral into sexual addiction. But think about the language here. The forbidden woman who's dripping honey, who has smooth speech, who is inviting in and come, be a part of this mystery only for the back end just to sting every consumer and to desensitize them and to destroy men in the process. It sounds very much like the pornography industry. Training people to see sex as a transaction, not as a culmination of a committed marriage relationship. Many men and women have been allured in by the sweet honey of pornography, and it has bitten them, and they've tried to get out, and it continues to bite them. That's a message for another time. We could go on. But I bring that up just to say, look, you may be saying, I have never engaged in adultery in a physical relationship with another person who has allured me in. But that doesn't mean that necessarily you aren't engaging in some level of adultery. Adultery can happen behind a computer screen. So this father says, look, this unchaste woman is a threat. But she's only a threat in so much as you allow her to be. And so what Solomon does next, he just goes on and continues teaching this lesson about adultery, the folly of it. Look at verses 7 through 11. And now, O sons, we'll just stop there. Notice the plural. At first, it's just one son. Now we're talking to sons, plural. Don't know who these sons are per se. But I want to submit to you what he's about to say right here. It's not just for this one son at this one point in time. This is for his sons because he's going to give generational wisdom to them that they need to heed. And now, O sons, listen to me and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless. Lest strangers take their fill of your strength and your laborers go to the house of a foreigner, and at the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed, and you say, how I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. What do you hear this father say? Son, I've just told you about the threat. Now I'm going to tell you about your responsibility. You need to flee. You need to not go near it. You need to stay far away from it. Don't even dabble in it. Don't even entertain it. Don't go to her door. You stay far away from it. This is just very pragmatic, practical advice. There's nothing superficial about this advice. Sometimes we think people need deeper motivations, and I would say in the long haul, you do need deeper motivations in your pursuit of holiness. There has to be other messages you have that'll captivate your heart to further you in God's holiness and plan for your life. But sometimes in the heat of the moment, you just need, don't go near. Flee it. I mean, the Apostle Paul picks this up in 2 Timothy 2:22, where he says, flee from temptation. Plenty of just pragmatic, practical wisdom here. Don't entertain Satan's schemes. Don't go near it. But in the case that a person would, let's say his son would go near it, this father begins to give 3 consequences that will happen in your life were you to not heed this advice. The 3 consequences. First, you're going to have an economic consequence. Second, you're going to have a social consequence. And third, you're going to have kind of an internal spiritual consequence that's going to come from this. The economic one is, when you consider families and a father in Israel at that time, he's passing down his generational wealth, his economic means to his sons. He's passing down his land. And even just one son to not go the path of wisdom and to go out and engage in a foreigner, it opens up the opportunity that he's going to lose some of that economic means and the whole family will suffer from it. And there are plenty of cases like that. So there's economic loss that could come from not heeding this wisdom. Some of the ways that people feel that in today's day and age is through alimony and child support that could potentially come from that. Second consequence is social. The language there, he speaks of you'll lose honor. You'll lose strength. There will be a loss of a reputation. Now, we don't get the direct insight here in Proverbs 5 that this unchaste woman is married. It's kind of understood, but in Proverbs 6 it just comes out and tells us this lure is a married woman. And so basically what he says, look, there's going to be a social ramification if you were to do this. Not only is that angry husband going to have a whole family involved and coming at you. You're going to have problems with that. You're going to have social problems with this other family that you have brought upon yourself. Not only that, but think about the spouse that you have left. There's going to be social fraction there and hurt there. There's going to be jealousy there. In fact, when you read deep in some of the Old Testament commentators, they'll say, now in Israel, an adulterous event that happened in Israel, you're open to the punishment of stoning. That there's a capital punishment for it. So it's a major deterrent in Old Testament Israel if that were to be carried out for people to think twice about it. But even for an Israelite man to get engaged with a foreign woman in this type of way, there's no death penalty there, but that you can read some of the custom things. They'll talk about that angry husband able to still put a punishment on that Israelite who took his wife. Some of that punishment is slavery. Now, you and I, in the age we live in, you're not going to reap the consequence of slavery for an action like that. But certainly, broken homes, hurt of all kind, jealousy of all kind, there's all kinds of social ramifications. And actually, when you let your eyes go down to later on when he's talking about the pain that he feels, He will talk about the shame that he feels in the company or the assembly of the congregation. Within the covenant family within religious family and friends and that covenant community, there's a shame that this person is feeling. In fact, that gets into our third consequence here, spiritual and mental. Again, at the end of your life, you groan. When your flesh and body are consumed and you say, how I hated discipline and my heart despised reproof, I did not listen. I did not incline my ear to my instructors. Listen to the agony. He says, I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembly of the congregation. This is this idea of, yes, there is social pain between families, between relationships, but also there's just this shame among your family of your spiritual family, your church. Notice the language there, assembly and congregation. That's language that shows up in the New Testament, here being referred to of Israel of old in the Old. But what do you hear him say? Regret. He's probably got this looped around in his head for the decisions that he's made, and the message is constant. I should have listened. The shame and the turmoil that he has. You know, when I was reading this passage, I just couldn't help. What kept going on in my head was the 1980s hit. Oh, here she comes. Watch out, boy, she'll chew you up. Oh, here she comes. She's a man-eater. And isn't that really what is going on here? But I will say this, there's an extra spin. When you hear the agony coming out of this man, it's not, she made me do it. It's not, she was so seductive. Look how she carried herself. She's to blame, and the blame shift out there at her. What's he saying? I didn't listen. I hated discipline. I got nowhere to point. Yes, she's guilty of her own sins. But I look inside myself and I say, I did wrong. I didn't heed the wisdom. I was never much of a Casting Crowns fan, or I'll just be pretty honest, and I hope that this isn't that offensive to people. Growing up in high school and whatnot, even in my early kind of conversion days on, I've never been that great of a fan of mainstream Christian music. I don't know what it is. I don't know. But I will say, Casting Crowns put out a song called Slow Fade, and it really reflects a lot of the trajectory that people have. Following kind of the wording here at Proverbs 5 and the price that is paid, and does a good job. And I just want to read some of those lyrics because I think they're incredibly pastoral for the person who's kind of in the thick of it. They say, be careful, little eyes, what you see. It's the second glance that ties your hands and darkness pulls the strings. Be careful, little feet, where you go. For it's the little feet behind that are sure to follow. It's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's a slow fade when black and white turns to gray. When thoughts invade and choices are made, there will be a price to be paid when you give yourself away. People never crumble in a day. It's a slow fade. And I would say that is the way I have seen it played out anecdotally in people's lives. People don't just create the event of an adultery immediately. It's usually a slow fade of compromises all along the way where black and white begins to turn to gray and you begin to kind of not listen to God's word, blah, 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 and it ultimately ends into shame and consequences that come from an adultery. It's a slow fade. So Solomon goes pretty honest with his son. But then he says, but you know what? Where do you go from here? How do you fight this? And how do you fight the temptation to get on this path and to go into adultery? And his answer is kind of surprising. It may surprise you, but basically his answer is, you need to enjoy sex. You need to enjoy sex in the covenant of marriage. Isn't that what he says? Verses 15 through 20, follow along with me. How do you fight temptation? It's the reality that God has given sex as a gift, and it's to be expressed open and often within the marriage covenant. And that's the protective layer that you need. He begins to describe that intimacy through water. Verse 15, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. That's pretty racy. What is the assumption that Solomon is saying here? Look, in the marriage covenant, your wife's body is your own. She is there in part for your pleasure. Now, the Apostle Paul will also come in 1 Corinthians 7 in the New Testament, and he'll say the flip side to the wife. Your husband's body is your own. He belongs to you. And in God's wisdom, the marriage relationship is two people who are giving themselves to one another, moving towards one another. When one spouse says, I'm here to serve you, and the other spouse says, I'm here to also serve you, and you come together, it's a beautiful blessing of marriage. It's a protective layer that God calls couples to have. Do not deprive your spouse of what belongs to them. What's the second point we can see from this? This marital intimacy is private. It's not public. It should never be public. He says, you don't leave it out into the streets. Let that be for yourself alone. You don't scatter it abroad. It's not for strangers. Well, that undermines the whole pornography industry, which is obvious. But it also undermines hookup culture, the friends with benefits culture that so easily entails. Private enjoyment for married people is God's standard. The third point from this little section here, 15 through 20, is that the wisdom of God for married couples is a blessing. It's for them to have free and frequent intimacy. This is the protective plan that God has given. I mean, just think about the wording that we just read there. Be intoxicated always in her love. Let her breast fill you at all times. You know, sometimes we think everything in moderation. And I think that's a good general rule of thumb for many situations. But when God talks about the marriage covenant and the sexual union within the marriage covenant, he says, go after it. Not in moderation. This is a gift to you, to both of you. And it's a protective plan. There's nothing wrong with it. Sexual sin outside of marriage is sin. Sex inside of marriage is not. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a protective thing. So let me just check in and ask a couple of questions. How are you at moving towards your spouse in intimacy? How are you at keeping that spark going? How are you avoiding just sinking into functioning like roommates? And how are you pursuing each other? I recognize that at different life stages and different complicating factors weigh into it, but I think it's a good question for all of us to ask, no matter who you are you delighting in your spouse? And if you're single, I would pose the question, how are you seeking to save yourself for your future spouse if God should call you into the marriage covenant? And I recognize for many single people, and I think we all should recognize it is a very different and difficult climate to choose God's path over the worldly path that so inundates them today. I'm not saying that that sexual temptation wasn't hard for previous generations. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that it's any different in some ways from even this first century. It was an over-sexualized century in the first century. You had prostitutes doing things in temples. But it's a very different thing when sexual temptation comes your way and not just flesh and blood reality. When you have social media and other things bombarding, it's hard for single people. and married people, but especially for single people who long for marriage. Do you have the support that you need? The last thing he lands on here in Proverbs 5, he grounds his teaching in theology. The last few verses basically just say this: don't chase after adultery, not just because of the consequences, not just because of the repercussions and your reputation, but you need to do it just out of love for God to not chase. That God watches. That God upholds a moral universe. That God has worked this universe in such a way that you reap what you sow, but the Lord looks on and he's invested in your life. It's not just avoid the consequences, it's not just enjoy your life just running away from the bad. It's recognize that God cares about your life. So what about you? Perhaps some of you have played the fool. Perhaps some of you who have regrets. I think it's helpful to realize that that God heals past sexual wounds. That is one of the things that God does. He is a redeemer, and he really heals people from their past. Adultery is not the unforgivable sin. Divorce is not the unforgivable sin. Christ bled for it, and he covered it for all of those who are his own. The foolish person doesn't allow their sin to drive them to the Savior, to the Redeemer, to begin the healing process. The foolish person doubles down and says, I hate this. But God comforts the downtrodden. Jesus is a friend of sinners. Jesus is a friend of sexual sinners. The unwise double down. They prove to be wicked, and in the end, they groan and they incur spiritual death. And in my experience, when someone has had the devastation of having to go through an adultery and perhaps a divorce that comes on the heels of that, it's a major harm to that person. And the social stigma of that is so hard for that person to continue to come to Christ and to continue to come back and engage in the church. Oftentimes when you see adultery and divorce happen in a person's life, they run far from the church. Maybe they don't want to hear it from other people. Maybe they just want to get out and escape. But when such a person comes back into the fold and stays in the covenant community, it is an obvious work of grace in their lives. And it is such an encouraging thing because it's obvious that God is doing an inner work of drawing them back in and not running from pain and regret of the past. God can redeem. And when I see situations like that, it is really encouraging to me. Perhaps you have just been tempted to play the adulterer. Perhaps you have had moments where you've been on the verge of acting. You need to hear what Solomon has said to his son, to turn away, to don't go near, to flee from it, to be strengthened in your discipline. If you're married, delight in your wife so that you don't run that way. Reignite the flame if you need to. As I was preparing this message, I came across an account of another pastor that was coming out of seminary, and he began to work at this other church as an assistant to a senior pastor who was a very devout religious man and a great communicator, deeply spiritual. The ways that he would describe this person is he would often get away and have great times of prayer and meditation, and really led an upstanding life. His family life seemed fine. His marriage with his wife seemed really great. They were married for 20 years, had 4 adult children who were in their teenagers. And so, he spent time around this other pastor. Well, he took a call to another church. His communication with this pastor kind of fell through until one day a common friend came and said, "Hey, did you hear what happened to Pastor so-and-so?" And he said, "No, I've been out of touch with him, and I think about him often. What has happened?" And he said, "Well, he left his wife, he left his family, and he moved in with another woman, a younger woman, more attractive in his congregation." And this pastor, upon hearing this news, was just dumbfounded. What? How is this even possible? Well, it was some time later, he actually ran into his former pastor at a conference, and he saw him, and he just looked haggard and bothered by life. And he said, can we go get a coffee? I know a little bit of the story. I want to hear from you. It's done damage to me thinking about this. Let's go get a coffee. So he goes and he gets a coffee with this man, and he says, how did this come about? And he said, it all started way back when my wife and I were teens. We went too far. She got pregnant. The families came and they put immense pressure on us, so we got married. And off and on over the past 20 years, we've really had, at various points, struggled with, he said, I just struggled off and on over the 20 years of doubt. Is this really God's right spouse for me? And when you have to keep coming back to that over and over the years, he said, eventually I concluded, I need to reject the wife of my youth. I need to go swim in some other pond. And that's what he did. He said Satan used those thoughts to drive a wedge between him and his spouse. He was lured away to someone more attractive and more compatible. And this pastor said after hearing that, I ended up, it was distraughting for him, but he said even a few years later, saw him at another conference, looked even more like he was zapped of the strength that he once had. That pastor said, every time I feel the lure to express some kind of sexuality beyond the marriage covenant, I think about that pastor, who he was, and that great fall that he had. What's the truth of Proverbs 5? Adultery will ruin your life. It will come on sweet, and it will end bitter. And how do you wage war against it? Yes, flee from it. Yes, delight in the wife of your youth. But if you don't have Jesus Christ in your life and you don't have the strength that he provides in those moments, you don't have much of a chance to heed those warnings. The text pushes us to have a heart for Jesus and a desire to walk an alternative path through the strength that he provides so that we don't walk with the ways of the world.